very first glance, my experience with my own second book is probably not going to be of much help. I wrote it in another country under a different set of academic conditions, and I took a usual and unusual but far from unique route because my first book was actually on a topic quite different from my dissertation. I'd become interested in another set of questions, and my dissertation, all 486 information full pages of it, had a spin-off into a collection of art criticism with a very substantial introduction, but then it was more or less fallow until I had time to work out what I really wanted to say, what the point of it was. And that proved to be a really good thing, because although the woman reader had a pretty good reception, I'd learned from those lines in reviews that hit home hard, in particular the comment that I didn't construct a strong enough historical narrative. So I had time after the reception of the first book to think about the methodological critiques that my work had and then adapt. And looking back, I realized that by the time I was working on VitViz, I'd absorbed a whole lot of other lessons. And I'm going to draw both on these and add them to what I've learned as a department chair here and elsewhere, and as someone who sits on upper level promotion committees, and as someone who co-edits a series. So my first point would be think big. I suspect that one's second book is usually the one that makes the biggest impact. Look back at the career of scholars you really admire. So often their first book, their dissertation book, is not the book that you know them by. Think about what you are going to be adding to debates in your field by way of questions. Think indeed of what you want to consider as your field. The conversations to which you want to contribute mightn't be the same as those that you were participating in when you started out. Fields change and your sense of your position within them will change. And you might be in a more extensive dialogue with work in other disciplines. Now's the time to build your contacts as well as your knowledge. Bluntly, you don't want your second book to feel like the development of a chapter that's fallen out of your first one. Of course, it might be on a topic that you've encountered, that you've put on one side when you were writing that. But to my mind, even if there's a close link that's known to you, that's understood by you, this is something that should be pointed out in the introduction, not something that can be seen right away from the title. And what's more, you want to feel fresh and excited and absorbed, not like, oh, here's more of the same. You're going to be spending 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever years with this. And then your second book is a statement of your intellectual growth and independence of mind. It's a chance to consolidate your own writing and prose style. Yeah, you might still be in contact with your dissertation supervisor. They may by now be a friend. They're still going to read your work and discuss things with you, but primarily you're no longer kind of writing for them or for the ghost of them that's haunting your work. Your main interlocutors are your peers, your colleagues, the people you've got to know in conferences and workshops and joint projects. So talk to them and take note of the work that's being done by scholars younger than you. The great thing is, you've now got the ability, most probably, to take charge of your own schedule. You might have a personal time frame for writing the second book, but if you're in an academic position, you no longer hear the clicking of the tenure clock. But the not so great thing is that the hours of the day are going to be less your own. Once you get tenure, you're vulnerable for being on so many more committees. You might want to launch particular initiatives. You might get to have more graduate students. You're going to have family commitments. You may have children or aging parents that get more complex and more unpredictable. And I know this will ring a bit hollow if you're an independent scholar, but every other point I'm making holds true. So even if you're free of pre-tenure pressures, try and structure your progress on your new book. Give yourself deadlines of conference papers to deliver. Aim to place a couple of articles in major journals, maybe organize a weekend seminar, a conference around your new topic, bring people together. You've probably had as part of your tenure dossier to show evidence of progress to a new project, but you don't have ever to stick to that. Mentioning institutions, a final institutional point. In many, though not in all places, it'll be your second book that gets you promoted to Flint. So know your institution's criteria. They may be more flexible, say, than the ones for tenure. They might admit of a public-facing book plus a set of podcasts, or a public-facing book plus an exhibition, say. They may be as admissible, things like that, as a so-called scholarly second monograph. But a co-authored book, even if brilliant and prize-winning, may not. Remember that those letter writers, when you come up for promotion, will likely be asked, would this person be promoted at your institution? And not all disciplines, not all institutions are necessarily as accommodating as your own. But I think that that is too ominous a warning note to end on. What really matters with your second book is that you get to feel as though you're in charge. This is your agenda, what you want to work on now. This is what really matters to you now. This is what's going to get you up in the morning and get into the archives. This is going to be fun. This is you defining your best academic self. That's it. Stopping sharing. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. That was brilliant. And our next speaker is Aniko.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me, right? Somebody just not yet. This was so lovely and so coherent. I really enjoyed the images. And now that Kate has laid out the general principles with which I fully agree, you get to look at my face for 7.5 minutes. And I apologize, I don't have a presentation. I'd like to fill out some of the, some of the principles that, or add to the principles that Kate outlined with some of my personal experience, most of which agree with what we learned, and some of which might be a bit unorthodox. I feel like, especially after listening to Kate, I wrote my first book as my second book. But I'm Aniko Imre. I work in the School of Cinematic Arts in Cinema and Media Studies. And I guess I now qualify as a full professor and a senior professor, more alarmingly, which is still kind of strange to say. Not as senior, not as experienced. I mean seniority in terms of experience, obviously, as Kate. But I have written 2 books as well, and I have also participated in a number of collaborations, and we'll be happy to talk about how those supplement or take the energy away from writing the book that qualifies you for promotion. And I also co-edit a book series, and I'll be happy to talk from the point of view of that experience as well. The book series is on global media. So I work at the intersection of media and communication and cultural studies, but my PhD was in English. And after I finished my dissertation, it became clear to me that I want to go into a different field. I had been working in film studies, even though I had come from an English department. And I landed in a 3-year collaboration in Amsterdam at the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis after finishing my PhD, where I was assigned a framework for a book project. And there were certain parameters that I had to follow, which again diverged from what my dissertation was about, and gave me a really great but somewhat constrained opportunity for thinking about my second book. So my first book, I think about it as a second book because it became so different from my dissertation. So whereas my dissertation was mostly about literature and cultural studies, post-coloniality, race. My first book, Identity Games, was about the post-communist transformations, identities, and digitalization, digital media. So I had to learn a whole new field. It took me 3 years to write it. There was very little original content in the book that came to be. I pitched it. This is something we haven't talked about yet, but I'm sure you have lots of thoughts and maybe questions about it. I pitched it to a book series with MIT Press. MIT Press has been traditionally interested in digital projects or projects that revolve around digitalization. Turned out that book series no longer existed. Sometimes what they have on the website is already outdated. But the press was interested. So my way of finding a match with the press both times was fairly simple. And then after this somewhat strange experience, I actually decided to follow Kate's advice and decided to think big and write something that was a passion project that didn't have external constraints. There were lots of ideas that came out of my first book, and it seemed logical to expand the parameters, the geopolitical parameters of my dissertation to Europe, from Eastern Europe to Europe. So I imagined something that was a book that was to tackle the European Union as a kind of family, a set of networks, digital and broadcast and branding and marketing networks. And I was actually called this project something like Brand New EU. Very clever. I realized that it's a pretty common title. I was not as clever as I thought. I got some funding for this project. I have 10,000 pages of notes for it. I started writing, publishing on branding, but I also started publishing on the side on television, which I was teaching. And I gradually realized that I am a lot more interested in television. So I set aside my great Think Big project and wrote a book on post-communist television, of kind of piecing together these articles that I started to publish on television. At the same time, somebody asked me to write about communist, late socialist television. And I got even more interested in that. So the idea came to be, and you could probably hear that my problem is always conceptualization. Thinking big becomes thinking too big. And the problem becomes how to restrict what I have to say to something disciplined, something that can be actually summed up in an elevator pitch, something that makes a very clear and contained contribution. This was a problem with my first book, which became way too big. It became a problem with my second book when I tried to focus on the continuity between late socialist and post-socialist television and do both. So the reviews came back. I pitched this to Duke University Press. Again, seemed very straightforward. The book eventually came out in the Consoling Passions series. But the continuity, the combination of late socialist and post-socialist television just grew too big to contain in one volume. I was so wedded to it. I really wanted to get all my ideas out there, despite the advice of the external reviewers who said, do just one piece and do the historical piece. That scared me because I'm not a historian and I knew I couldn't deliver on a truly historical project. So I published this big, broad conceptual project. And sure enough, people read it as a history of socialist television, despite my best intentions. So half the book, which is about post-communist TV, pretty much got ignored in the many, many reviews that I got. So I once again committed the same mistakes. And I'm looking towards my third book, if I ever get to write it, as the one where I follow my advice to design something that can be summed up in an elevator pitch. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Aniko. And our final presenter is Jessica, I cannot see you, but you must be.
I'm here.
Okay.
Can you see me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kate and Aniko, for these really wonderful reflections, and thanks, Daniela, for inviting me and putting this together. I am not yet in the category of having published my second book. I'm actually right now in the process of sending it out to a press to have it sent out to readers. I just have to put those little touches before I'm ready to let it go, as I'm sure we all are familiar with. So and I'll just say very briefly, I'm broadly an historian of Jews in North Africa and the Mediterranean. My first book looked at Jews and law in Morocco, and this new book is a microhistory of a legal case that played out between Tunisia and Italy. And I think, as we all do, at some level, we can only speak from our personal experience, so of course I will. But I'll also say a few things, because I'm an opinionated person, that I probably have no right to say, but that I believe strongly anyway. The first thing that I'll say about writing a second book, which is, I think, just my general take on academia, is that you have to find a project that you are really passionate about. That is the only, ultimately, I really think that is the only thing that matters. That is always the only thing that matters in academia, because God knows we don't do it for the money or for the flexibility of where we get to live or for the wonderful job market or any of that, right? We do it because we are so driven somehow to enter this crazy profession that is, who knows what's happening to it right now as we speak. But anyway, and I think that, I don't know, I think that what Kate was saying about the pressures that increase after the first book is really true. And once you publish a book, people kind of start to know who you are, and then they ask you to do things, and you want to say yes because they're interesting things and you're excited about it, and then you find yourself doing all of these things, and then sometimes you have ideas, and it's all wonderful, but it does take a lot of that time, and you're teaching, and you're serving on committees, and. So I would say that there's a lot more, that those demands on your time is real, and I think also, again, for those people who are on the tenure, who are lucky enough to be on the tenure clock, the kind of, you're about to fall off a cliff if you do not publish the first book. You have to publish the first book. That goes away. And, I think that in order to avoid the kind of lack of deadline problem of the second book, there needs to be a truly internal push. This is something that you care about so much, you need to get it out in the world. And so really, like, I'll say some more things, but really that's the main thing that I want to say. And as somebody's sharing the screen, which is not me, but anyway, I'll just keep going. So I think, that's my main advice. I think that, I think it's, the relationship of the first book to the second book in terms of scope, in terms of topic. The way I went is I started out working on Morocco, which is a pretty obscure place. It's not like, there's like a big market for books on Morocco in North Africa automatically, certainly not for Moroccan Jews. I would say it's not like by going to Tunisia or a Tunisian-Italian connection, I went to a much broader topic. But I was interested in broadening in the sense of going from just North Africa to the Mediterranean and trying to think about North Africa in the Mediterranean context, which was for me a broadening move and a way of speaking to a broader audience, and a way, in some ways, really, and I think this is probably, unless you work on the Civil War, but some of you do probably work on the Civil War. I think many of us find ourselves in these relatively obscure corners of academia. And one of the things that I think I was excited to do with my second book, and that I think is a kind of opportunity, is that you can kind of take that obscure corner and try to shake people by the shoulders and say, this is why you should know about my obscure corner about academia, right? And I think that that's one way of thinking. The first book is sort of proving your chops in that obscure corner, proving that you can be a scholar of that little tiny thing that you work on. And I think the second book can be, or at least that's how I've thought of my second book project, a way of saying, guys, you people who work on modern European history, who work on, modern global history, you really should care about North Africa. You didn't know you should care about North Africa, but you really should care about North Africa and North African Jews, and here's why. And so I think that that's one way of thinking about what it means to go bigger, is just trying to make your little corner relevant to that broader audience. But, you know, I'll just say I'm doing it via microhistory. So that doesn't necessarily mean doing like the big book on X topic. I think you can go bigger in different ways. And I think, you know, that there are multiple kind of templates for that. The third thing I want to say is about the style of the second book. And, you know, I think that I really resonated with a lot of what you both said about just the kind of finding your own voice as a writer. And I felt like I've been able to take risks with the second book that I didn't feel like I could take with the first book, in terms of writing. For me, in my experience, I'm writing a much more narrative book, one that really does tell a story from the beginning to the end. And one of the things that I have struggled with, but also really enjoyed, is that, you know, in my first book, it was very monographic. Each chapter was written large, you know, it was written as a book, but it was also written with each chapter with the idea that you could read that alone and it would kind of stand for itself. And I workshopped each chapter in various places, and, you know, there were lots of different people read each chapter. This second book, you can't really read each chapter alone. None of them make sense because it's part of a narrative. And in some ways that was terrifying, because it meant I couldn't really share the pieces as I was writing, which is what I had done with the first book. And in other ways, it was incredibly liberating, because I could just sit down and write this story as I saw it. And I could tell, you know, I had this sort of vision, and we'll see, it hasn't been published yet. Maybe it'll come back to bite me in the ass, but certainly I've really enjoyed experimenting with this really different voice and this really different style. And personally, I've wanted, you know, one of my ambitions for the second book is to reach a broader audience of readers, not just a broader academic audience, but a broader audience of readers beyond the academy, of people who are just smart and interested. And I think that that's another luxury, again, you know, if you're on the tenure track, that's another luxury that one has with the second book. The last thing I'll say in the 1 minute remaining to me is that I would recommend entering into conversation with editors as you're starting to work on the second book project, because one of the things that I've found has been really pleasant is that now that I already wrote a book, editors think I'm a human being, and they'll actually respond to my emails and talk to me. And in fact, I've even had an editor reach out to me and say, hey, that looks interesting. Do you want to talk about it? And it's been actually really helpful, just every so often at a conference, you know, once a year or something, to sit down and talk for half an hour with an editor and get that perspective, which, you know, weirdly, you'd think in academia, academic publishing isn't so far from what we do. And yet the world of editors feels very foreign. And so, you know, and now that I'm in the process of, you know, sending it out, I already have a pretty established relationships with a couple editors. So the process of getting my book proposal to them and getting them interested and sharing my vision for the book has felt like a completely different beast from the first time around, where I felt like I had absolutely no leverage and I was a complete nobody. So I'll stop there because I think I'm out of time, and look forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Thank you so much to everyone. To ask a question, I ask that you please use the raise hand under reaction so that I can see everyone. If you can turn on your camera for the Q&A, it's really helpful for the speakers to see who is asking the question. I believe the first person to raise their hand was Lawrence Chua.
Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you for those three really inspiring presentations. I had a sort of larger question about how you navigate that territory between thinking big and thinking passionately about a new subject and expertise. So I mean, like, the first book really comes out of a very long period of training in which you feel like you are the expert in that. You know how, you know this field, this subject inside and out. And in a way, it's pretty easy to crank out that book. I mean, in hindsight, it seems easy. But for the second book, I mean, especially as you're exploring like new areas, I wonder, like, how do you, I mean, I can't be the only person of color with imposter syndrome, but like, how do you negotiate those, you know, that you're sort of like intervening in a new field?
That is a really important question. Thank you so much. I am going to ask the speakers or our panelists to not everybody respond to every single question, because otherwise we don't have enough time for the questions. So to self-select, I'm happy to moderate, but if anybody wants to come in right on this, Kate, I think I see you've unmuted yourself, so maybe you can start.
Okay, I think this is where doing some work and asking big questions centering around a small example in a conference paper is helpful. And the other thing that I find really helpful is teaching. Whether you have the opportunity to teach a graduate seminar or an upper level undergraduate seminar, or one of those sort of fabulous small undergraduate courses where you get them to do some research for you. I think that also maps onto how one's unfolding career bumps into other things in one's life, locational shifts and so on, institutional differences. I certainly know that my books, since the ones I was talking about, have been increasingly American because I've been working in America, which is a crude bit of simplicity, but it's, I think, don't expect that the thinking big is going just to come to you in the shower, though that's a good place to try. Your actual life, everything that you read, the people you encounter, will help determine how you see big questions. But teaching, that would be my, in a sense, something one mightn't think of off the top of one's head, but it's crucial.
Thank you, Kate. Jessica and Aniko. Aniko, do you want to come in on this, or should we move to the next question?
Just very, very quickly, it's just, and you already know this, that whenever we expand, whenever we embark on a new project, it's going to happen in that gray zone between your comfort zone and the new zone of discomfort, where you take those risks that Jessica was talking about. But it's never, the more you do, the more you will also rely on the foundational work that you had done in graduate school and after. So even when you approach a new topic, you're going to rely on the paradigms, unless you are truly adventurous, and I know people like that, but I am personally not like that. You will inevitably use whatever you have accumulated in your brain to grasp a new material. So it's going to be less scary, and you will have more of a standing, more of an authority, more of a reputation in the field as someone who has something to add from what you had already accumulated. So it's actually much less scary. So, I mean, I know people who went from media studies to neuroscience, or people who are, who come from cultural studies and actually went to study in the archives and figure out how to do that properly. But most of us don't. But it's okay. We already have the foundation.
I think that one of the things that comes through from the presentations and also the answers to this is that while the path from dissertation to first book for academics is pretty straightforward, after the first book, it really is the garden of forking paths, and there's so many different directions. And there are scholars who will do a second book, a third book, that are sort of more of links in a chain, but the same chain. And there are scholars who will have drastic departures. And as I think all speakers mentioned, but I don't know that anyone said it very directly as such, is know thyself. What kind of scholar are you? What's going to make you happy? So if you choose to stay sort of more or less in the same road, as long as that's what sets your heart on fire, that will be, and if you choose to do a drastic redirection, that will take more time and will be harder, but that needs to be the right path for you. The next question was from Alice Baumgartner.
Okay. Thank you guys so much for all of these great presentations, which really helped to talk about some of the differences and challenges between writing a first book and writing a second book. And my question follows up on some of those differences, where in graduate school, you have these check marks going forward, not just with the dissertation, but just with coming up with the research topic. And I was curious if any of you had any suggestions about good ways to get feedback about the topic itself. I know that many people have talked about presenting at conferences, but having presented once at a conference with a half-baked idea, it was I felt like that was maybe not the best place to do that. So I'd be curious where you guys got feedback on early conceptions of your projects.
I can weigh in briefly. I mean, I think, you know, I would say that there are conferences and there are conferences. And I think like the big impersonal conference may not be the place to try out the new ideas where you have no idea who's going to be in the room. I had a couple really, really helpful early experiences of small workshops with people close to my field, where I presented very early and in retrospect, completely wrong and, you know, sort of misguided versions of the thing that became my second book topic. And at the time I was already like, I was like flirting with this topic. Like we were interested in each other, but we hadn't like gone out on a date, you know, like I hadn't said like, yeah, we're going to be exclusive. You're going to be my book. And the feedback that I got at those early conferences, which were smaller and less kind of random than the big ones, was that people were like excited, you know, like, oh yeah, this is interesting. This could be good. So that was one thing. And then again, it was my gut. Like for me, it was really like, this was a project that I was interested in. I got some interesting feedback and I went to the archives and I was like, this, you know, I fell in love the documents and what the promise that I saw there, and I still didn't understand it. But so, you know, I think that I would say if you can find those smaller, more focused and friendlier venues where you also trust people more a little bit. For me, that was really helpful in giving me that kind of confidence. And then also those exploratory archive trips, for me, again, if you're not archivally based, but I think just that dig into the sources as a kind of like, let's see what I can come up with, and just trusting, you know, what it feels like to be there.
I think that I've learned a lot through following through a particular topic, a particular question, and telling myself that it's going to be part of a bigger whole, and then presenting on that at conferences. And as I've thought of it as part of a bigger whole, whatever that bigger whole might be, I've actually expanded my original topic and realized it had so many different ramifications that a book on Native American understanding of British people was not a chapter in a book about American attitudes towards Britain. It actually was a topic of something else. And that, I think, I partly got to through talking with friends, and friends who would say, well, why does this matter? But also, again, through the kind of conference feedback that comes through questions and people asking questions that kind of take one off guard. And then you realize, well, actually, this intersects with all sorts of other things. So that's why I think it's useful to share the half-baked, but be honest about it, to say this is really fresh work. I'm genuinely interested in knowing where my gaps and my the problems with this are, and be upfront about it. Because you have tenure, you can do that in most cases.
May I add, I know I'm the third one to speak, but from a somewhat different angle, if I'm hearing the question right, Alice, it's also about reading the market, you know, because we're talking about publishing a book, not an article. And yes, it starts from somewhere, but when you decide whether it's publishable, whether you can interest hundreds or thousands of people in it, you are really trying to get a feel for what is both current and important, but also enduring. So a dissertation dissertation on Netflix might be a great topic for an article, but I'm not sure it will be a great topic for a book for 10 years from now, because who knows if Netflix is going to be the same or still with us. So for that, I think you have to follow your gut, as Jessica says, and that gut kind of builds up over time. So there is a bit of an instinct, but you can also inform your instinct quite in an educated fashion. If you just look at the most cited articles in the journals of your field, you know, what is trending? What are the important conversations that people maybe across fields or subfields are resonating with? That will also maybe resonate periodically. And I think we all have some examples of maybe stuff we wrote a long time ago that keeps coming back, that in unexpected ways. And it's worth revisiting over and over again. So it's, you know, the publishers are not the best sources for it, I find, because they come to us for ideas. They want to know what is trending. So it's really, you have a lot of authority and a lot of power in determining what is trendy, what is going to be not just trendy, but truly important in the market.
Thank you all. We have at least 3 more questions and 20 minutes. So let's just try to keep a track of that. I think the next question was from Sean Fraga.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the panelists for your time and for these thoughts about framing a second project. I'm coming at it as a postdoc who has a book contract for my first book, but is still revising the dissertation manuscript into that book manuscript. I'm curious what your advice would be for framing a second project for search committees for tenure track jobs in relation to the first project, especially when the second project isn't really much more than an elevator pitch at this point for me.
I would say frame it as something that is actually very different from your first project. By all means say, whilst you were writing your first project, I realized how little work had been done on X, or I started to find I was asking questions about Y. But I'll go back to that sense that you should not be saying, this book follows on from my first project, unless you're actually writing a sequential history and your first project dealt with 1800 to 1840. I think it would then be fair enough to take 1840 to 1880. But it should not be, it should not sound like it's an appendage or an afterthought or as though you haven't got fresh ideas. And I'll stick to the point that I also made when I was talking about you aren't going to be held to what you say your next project is on. So you really need to sound as though you are in conversation with today's sort of most dynamic questions, but that you're coming at them freshly, and that you're going to continue to be a groundbreaking scholar with your new, completely new work.
I'll just say very quickly that I have given a number of different versions of my second book at Job Talks, none of which turned out to be my second book. And I would also say that I think in this case, it could also be to your benefit, or I found it to my benefit, to tailor the second book project a bit to the job. So there were certain jobs which I was maybe somewhat qualified for, but I kind of said my second book was going to be much more in that area. And I don't, again, I think that what Kate and Danielle have both said, it's really about showing that you have more ideas and that you can't, you are thinking along those lines. But I think in that instance, it's not a bad idea to also think carefully about, what is this position? What are the particulars of it? Unless you already really do have a second project that you're actually really thinking about actively, in which case then you would just be honest about that. But I think it's also okay to be a little strategic.
Terrific. The next question is from Lisa Vest.
Hello, and thank you so much for the insights you've shared from the panelists. I have just published my first book, so my first book has just come out. Thank you. I'm super excited about it still. My author copies arrived on election night, which was very weird. But anyway, so I have been thinking about book 2 for some time. I've already done some conference presentations related to it. And so my question is sort of practical. I am, my contract with University of California Press with the first book specifically gives them the first right of refusal. So I kind of want to know, I loved working with them, but my second book, it has a pivot point from the first project, but it's quite different. The first book was Cold War archival work, and the second book is going to be more media cultural criticism. I guess I just wondered if any of you had that experience of working with the same editor, the same press for your second book, and if that's something that I should pursue very clearly. I should say they've expressed general interest in the topic that I'm going for, but it would be a different direction for them too.
I had that experience. Kate, did you unmute to talk about that? Or?
No, I unmuted. Well, no.
So I think you can ask the editor. I certainly did, because I wasn't sure. It seemed like, wait a minute, we're talking about the first book and you're already taking dibs on the second. And so I asked, and the editor was like, it's all cool. Like, we'll figure it out. And then when it came to my second book, I definitely did not want to do it with the press, and I went with a different press. Jessica, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, same. I had a good experience with my first book, with my first press, but I did want to go with the second press, and I had that, right of first refusal option. And I just wrote to my editor and said, I think I'd like to send it out to other people. And she and I had been in conversation about my book because we just would meet and talk about it. And she wanted to see the proposal, but then she was very gracious and said, that's fine if you want to send it to other people. I've never heard, I was also like, oh shit, this exists in my contract. Ooh, what do I do? Which of course I didn't pay attention to at the time, because when they offered me a contract, I was like, I'll sign anything. I just want my book published. But I talked to a few people about getting out of that first right of first refusal. I've never heard of anybody being held to it. It seems like, unless you're going to make the press like big bucks, which I'm certainly not. They just have no, why would they do that? Why would they want to work with an author who doesn't want to work with them? So I think it's generally not a problem. I think the one thing I would just say is, if this is at all a press you ever might want to work with, or an editor you want to work with, you want to do it carefully and graciously. You don't want to burn any bridges, but you shouldn't worry about it. It shouldn't be a source of anxiety.
And yeah. I agree. It's the academic market. It's not a money-making operation. And so while contract might sound serious and scary, most of these things are quite negotiable, I think. So I wouldn't worry about that. However, I think it is important to tailor your project to a matching series, a really supportive editor. So as I said earlier, I just want to underscore the strategic and practical and conceptual importance of working with a series, because then you have academics in charge, such as Kate or myself, who can advocate for you, who can really measure up your project and see if it's a good fit, and then can be a go-between between you and the press editor. So I think that's a really good strategy, especially for first books.
Yeah, I mean, I've moved around a lot, and I think that working with an editor who I really trust, and an editor for the press I haven't published with a series, that is why I have moved. And editors themselves have in the past been extremely mobile, so that has made it more complex. I also care about what the book's going to look like. I mean, this is partly because I want my images to look good, but it really matters to me their production standards, what kind of printing they're using, who they're using to do layout, and so on. And then finally, and distribution, absolutely. Finally, when I was a grad student, I had a temp job working in the legal part of the Society of Authors in London. And a lot of that job involved vetting or helping to vet book contracts. And the Society of Authors standard advice was to cross out that option clause and initial it. I've never known a publisher then or since follow through on it, but if you have it crossed out and initialed, that's in future the way to go, and nobody's going to care at all about it now.
Thank you, everyone. I have no raised hands. It's hard to imagine that people don't have more questions about.
There's Catherine Dickinson.
I checked in with
question.
her. Her question
Oh.
has been answered. Yeah. So maybe I can ask a question of the panelists, because one of the things you all brought up is that both the pressures and the circumstances vary radically for a second book to from a first to a second book, and we all know that as you know, writing a second book is really a first book is really a publish or perish situation, but we all know that the path to a second publication is incredibly diverse. It varies enormously. There's a big if. It is not always guaranteed, and the time frame varies greatly in response perhaps to those pressures. So part of it is about how to conceive of the second book, which is something that you all address, but part of it is about how to carry it through. And I was wondering if that would be something helpful to talk about strategies for not just coming up with a project, but being very clear with oneself about what are the variables, what is the process, what is the goal, and to sort of chart a path.
I think that Jessica was spoke in part to this when she said that once you have published your first book, you're much more out there, you're more visible, you're an authority, and you get flattering invitations. You also are somebody who is more visible within your own institution. You're somebody who dares speak up. You're somebody who sounds powerful and articulate in your meetings and such like. In other words, you are so vulnerable to be your next director of graduate studies for your department, or even your next chair. And I was chair in Oxford between my first and my second book, and that was I wasn't in that same kind of hierarchical institution at that point, as at least I didn't think that I was, but actually I was. And writing the second book kind of held me back in terms of CV terms for a few extra years. And for what? Being a chair? It is so not worth it. So just don't feel, hey, I'm a grown up now. It's wonderful to be asked to do these things, which are actually going to be an administrative suck on you. Take those academic opportunities, because those are going to help you make contacts and share your ideas and such like. But the more administrative ones, ignore the fact that your department chair or dean or whatever will hate you for saying no to all of these things. They'll get over it, and just be as protective of your own time until that second book is done. Then you can decide, hey, maybe I even want to go more into administration, or maybe I want to go more into making podcasts, whatever it might be.
I'm so glad that Kate brought up this point. I think that I agree that writing the second book and publishing it is an easier experience because you're more confident, because you know how it works, because you have those contacts. You just have more gravitas, and that's fine. But at the same time, you're probably at a time of your life when you have other obligations, aging parents, people to take care of, children, and the administrative duties which tend to fall disproportionately on certain kinds of people. And I don't just mean women and people of color, which is statistically very true, but also people who seek out those opportunities. So if you're one of those people who actually gets genuine satisfaction out of not administrative, but service work, then you are in trouble. And it's because then you're struggling with your own purpose in life. And I also found myself in this situation, going from director of graduate studies to undergraduate studies to chair and faculty senate and who knows what. I'm on a bunch of committees. And it's very hard to do all those things at the same time. So, so I wouldn't say, and I might disagree a bit with Kate, I wouldn't say just refuse the service, because it's a nice way to distract yourself from the sometimes quite lonely path of writing. And the questions that we ask ourselves probably more intensely now under COVID, is it worth it? Am I just writing for myself? And, when you are over 50, maybe your legacy. And sometimes I think my legacy is more in my teaching or more in the changes I made to the curriculum than in the book I'm going to write. So these are difficult negotiations, no easy answers.
I would just echo the art of saying no, for sure. But then one thing which may be so obvious that it's not worth mentioning, but it hasn't been mentioned. I mean, I think for me, the key thing to being able to advance on the second book project was getting research leave, was getting fellowships, because one can work while one is teaching full time, but man, it's tough. And frankly, I know this isn't possible for everybody, because of family obligations and all of that. But I found that for me, the fact of going away on my research leaves was hugely helpful, because the times that I've been on leave in Los Angeles, except for last spring when everything shut down and everybody was sort of gone. But in general, one just gets sucked into things at USC very easily, and you have to, like, I don't know, I'm not good at like digging the right moat around my life to protect myself. I found that when I was away, I mean, I spent a year and a half on research leave abroad, and besides, access to archives and all of that, which was great, more than anything, I think it was just the fact of like, I wasn't around, I couldn't do things, I wasn't like completely MIA, the things that really mattered, graduate students, things like that, but mostly I was just not around. And so that really gave me a kind of freedom to immerse myself in my work, which I hadn't had since graduate school. And without that, I'm not sure I could have made the progress that I made on the book. So I know it's not, I know that not everybody can do that, but I would encourage, I think it is really key to get those research leaves, to just, and then to really use them and say, this is what I'm doing. I am just doing the book. I am not doing anything else. That for me was probably the most important.
Yeah, this whole I think is very sound advice. And maybe one thing to say is, it's interesting for me to hear Aniko say the second book is much easier than the first. I do not think that. I think with the first you have 5 years of writing, of working in dissertation, with very little, with no service, and you will never start a book with a full draft again, right? So it's very hard to write a first book. I'm not saying it's easy. It's super hard, but it's very hard in an entirely different way to write a second book. And so I think that creating the structure that helps you and that supports you, as our panelists have said, with protecting your time, with knowing your reasons for doing it and setting your own goals and creating the structure. But something that we haven't mentioned is that for the first book, you don't do it alone. You go from having professors and a committee, but also friends in grad school who are also doing that, to being an assistant professor and hopefully having mentors and having supporters and having colleagues who are also writing books and helping you. And I think that that doesn't go away. The structure that provides that goes away after tenure. There's so much effort poured into getting assistant professors to tenure, even though it may not feel like that. But that doesn't quite remain in place. And so it's super important to create that for yourself, to expand your network of mentors, of supporters, of people you talk to who can give you their advice and their help, and peers who you are working with towards the same goal. I think I see Jessica saying email is the enemy, which I really like.
Enemy, but anyway, yeah.
I prefer enemy.
Enemy. Yeah, no, I'll just second what you said, Daniela. I think writing, for me, participating in writing groups, which I did virtually even before we all moved our lives onto Zoom, has been super key and super fun. It's actually been one of the great sources of academic odium in my life since the end of grad school in particular, and for the second book, it's been really unbelievably helpful.
Agreed. Well, we are at time and there's no digital hands. Thank you to our speakers, Kate, Aniko, Jessica, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for their questions. It is part of my job to mention that today's program is part of the Levin Institute's How To series. A monthly 1 hour long workshop on how humanists do the things we do. And our next program, it's in March and it's on models for collaboration in the humanities and social sciences. So please join us for that. Thank you so much to everyone.